Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Equals. This is Max.
Hi guys, this is Nadia. Max, how's it going?
Well, the big news in our house this afternoon, the boys came home from school in tears. The school's closed early because of COVID. It was meant to close for the holidays on Friday, but because the cases are going up quite dramatically here in London, they closed the school early and the boys are missing their Christmas party. They're really upset.
Oh, I
I know,
bet
it's
they
sad,
are.
isn't it?
If it makes them feel any better, you can tell them that our schools never opened to begin with. So my kids have not been able to go to their school since March 2020, and I have no
Wow.
idea when they're going to be able to go back. Yeah, it's just nuts, man. The caseload is awful. Some places in the US have opened, but not in our area. And I mean, at least they really do have strong virtual learning opportunities and are becoming Zoom ninjas. So, I mean, at least we have that. I know many don't.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, so do ours, but it was really interesting. I mean, even I mean, obviously, school is new for us because we've just moved back from Kenya. When they said they were closing the school, half the children got these kind of workbooks with kind of worksheets, but our kids didn't get any. And Stanley was upset, so we asked the teacher, and she said that all the kids who've got workbooks are the ones who don't have online. They don't have Google Classroom, so it's still even here in London a real digital divide, and you can see there's a big difference between those who got that access and those who haven't.
So they basically don't have internet, those kids.
Well, either that, they've got big families, so they can't all work on Google Classrooms at
Right.
once. I think that's more
Got it.
common.
Yeah.
So yeah, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's that big inequality within even a country like the UK, and then there's this huge inequality between countries. And I'm really excited that we're getting to talk about that today with Dr. Prachi Srivastava. She's actually focused on, what is the global education emergency caused by COVID-19 pandemic, looking at issues of inequality. She's an associate professor at the University of Western Ontario. Her work is feeding into G20 policy discussions, and she's really the kind of academic I love, putting her research into practice. And I came to know her through her work pre-COVID, looking at the impact of for-profit schools targeting low-income communities, or low-fee private schools, as she coined, in South Asia and elsewhere. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, definitely. The issue of private schooling, education privatization in developing countries, I think, is extremely relevant and led to the weakness of education systems when the crisis hit. And then
Mhm.
after Prachi, what we're going to do is we're going to try something we haven't done before, I don't think, or I haven't done, is a kind of debrief together with our friend and ally Linda Oduor-Noah from Kenya, who's an education activist, and she's been fighting privatization in Kenya over the years. So she's going to bring her insight and her examples to our analysis of what Prachi had to say. So that should be good too.
Absolutely. So a lot to cover. Shall we get on with it?
Yeah, we really should. Let's.
Prachi, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's a really busy time and very much appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks, Nadia. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this podcast, and I feel very honored to be amongst the guest list here that you have.
And we're honored to have you. And what an interesting time it is for you to be working in the field of education. I mean, the disruptions we're seeing around the world in education are massive, of course. And I wonder if you can set the scene for us here globally. What are some of the longer term impacts on education inequality that could result from the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, so it's an interesting time, but it's also a very worrying time, and I think it's a very stressful time for many of us who are working in global education, and of course for most of us who are in some way involved in the education system, whether it's personally having children in the system or just being engaged citizens. I think some of the big macro numbers that people would have heard already is that the school closures that we saw in the first phase of the pandemic reached a peak, and they kind of affected, between 1.6 to 1.7 billion children. And that roughly equates to over 90 to 92% of learners. If you look at that in terms of population back, proportions, you're looking at almost 95% of the total population of children and youth. And in terms of humanity, so if we just look at it in terms of global humanity demographics, we're talking about roughly a fifth of the world's population, right? That's 20% almost of all the people that inhabit our Earth have been affected by this directly, because that's the population breakdown. So, framing all my comments within that, I think when you ask what the long term implications are in terms of inequalities, well, we know that the disruptions are going to have differential effects on different countries, different regions within countries, and different groups of people within and across countries. And we also know that the education disruptions are going to affect those people that were already negatively affected going into the pandemic relatively more than others, right? Roughly 900 million children did not return or returned in precarious circumstances, even when schools reopened generally. And that has to do a lot with infrastructure issues. It has to do with some of the lingering issues that education systems faced even before the pandemic. And we also know that 500 million children never really had any form of remote learning. None. So,
And that's mainly in poor or
yes,
low income countries?
yes,
Okay.
these will be in more low middle income countries. And then within countries, these will be populations that are underserved in those countries. So, for example, we know that children with special needs often tend to get left out during emergency switches of provision. We also know that when we're talking about remote or distance learning, a lot of the emergency measures were really about emergency switch to online. And that's not always feasible in every context. It's also not feasible for every type of learner. Younger learners that have different modalities of learning. Of course, there's a whole issue of broadband provision. Then there's a whole issue of parents and whether or not they're able to support their children in terms of that kind of learning, if they're learning from home. And I want to go into a little bit about structure here. Over the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen an underfunding of systems, education systems. And we've seen a hollowing out of those bureaucracies, administration systems that actually are supposed to make sure that the system runs, right? When you're underfunding and you're not hiring enough people to make sure that the system has officers in charge or people that are actually monitoring the system on the ground, when there's an emergency, all of that compounds.
Right. And I'm trying to understand now with, you've set this scene about what's happening. What are the longer term impacts on inequality that we might see coming out of all of this?
Yes. So we know anyway from previous pandemics, these long-term impacts have significant effect on things like lifetime income and earning loss, on learning loss, on, of course, psychosocial health effects. We know that there's increased underage pregnancies, sexual and physical abuse that happens with long-term school closures. But in terms of life opportunities and learning and earning loss, I don't think citizens and also just general like governments and even donors have really recognized the true impact of that. So there's a modeling study that came out. There's a paper that was written by George Sakharopoulos and his colleagues, and this modeling study came out in a couple of months ago, and the figures there are just shocking. They model what it could mean in terms of having just 4 months of school closures. And they model that globally in terms of earning and learning loss. And what they find in terms of earning loss is that 4 months of school closures could result in lifetime earning loss of this generation globally of $10.6 trillion.
Wow.
It's
Wow, that's a lot.
massive, huge. Okay. This is massive. And I don't think people have really appreciated what that means for the next generation. It just blows your mind.
Prachi, can I ask you? specifically, I mean, I think the impacts on girls in particular have been quite dramatic. I wonder whether you could say a little bit about that and how that's played out in different countries around the world.
Yeah, so what we're going to see is the way that different groups of people are inserted into our societies is what really determines how badly they are going to be affected, right? So globally, we know that in many, many countries, girls tend to be in that group. But then there are a bunch of other cross-cutting, multidimensional factors, right? So you could be a rural girl, you could be a rural girl from a lower caste community, from a religious minority, from an underserved area, right? All of those things will compound to make the situation better or worse, depending on what is valued in the society in which you live and what is devalued in the society in which you live. So when you talk about girls, yes, we've already seen that there are inequitable effects on girls and women as a result of the pandemic. We know that, for example, many of the caring functions that already women and girls carry are already being aggravated now during the pandemic. Some of that is a direct result of labor market opportunities. Some of that is a result of gender norms. And some of that is a result of actually having to take on more burden, right, within caring roles. So when that compounds then with having already inequitable access, we're going to see that in countries where that gender parity was already volatile and where already we had issues with girls and women being able to participate in education to the extent that they should, we're going to see that. And I think what we're going to see globally is pockets of that within all our communities. For example, in higher income countries, it's going to affect racialized minority groups that are also doing frontline work and what that means in terms of domestic labor and opportunity, right? We're going to see that in a different way playing out. And we're going to see that in a very different way playing out in countries, low income countries, where already girls were at a disadvantage in terms of entering the system.
The way you expressed the intersectionality was absolutely spot on.
And if you don't mind, if I could be a little bit informal here, the reason I'm always thinking about intersectionality is because, I inhabit that world, an Anglophone brown kid from 1970s Quebec. But for me, the markers around intersectionality are so present in my own identity. I've lived in many, many different countries. I am the most privileged when I do my work in India because from my last name, you can infer my caste, which is a high caste. I am born into a Hindu tradition. That's the dominant religion. My family comes from the dominant region. Like all of that is inferred from my last name. And,
Wow.
and as a result, and I speak Hindi and I actually do speak Hindi pretty well. Like I'm okay. That credit goes to my mom. But, so as a result, when I'm doing my work, when I go to India, and of course I have all the other markers of being, well educated, coming from a particular social class background. People can infer the fact that I'm a researcher. I have a certain positionality in society, which I have a hard time with, but it is what it is. And my family actually, were landowners pre-independence. So there's a lot of indicators that are attached to my last name and just what I do, the characteristics that are ascribed to me, right? And
Right.
things that I
Sure.
attained and things that I have been ascribed, over which I have no control. But in Canada and also in the UK, those characteristics are muted, right? So that's not what people see. That's not what they infer. They see a brown woman who is an Anglophone from Quebec. If I live in Quebec, and there's a certain level of privilege or or a lack of privilege associated with that. Same thing in the UK. So I'm the same person. I'm exactly the same person. I have the same attributes, regardless. I'm that same person. But certain parts of my identities are accentuated in a way in which I have tremendous privilege. And in certain parts of my positionality are muted in such a way as to defy that privilege. And that's why this whole intersectionality is so important to me when we're having these big discussions around inequality and education and life opportunities, because a lot of those are things we don't have any control over. But our systems and the way our systems work and the way we structure our systems, we do have some control over. So, if anything, I hope that the pandemic can allow us to see some of that a little bit more, because it's affecting all of the countries, but it's affecting all of the countries differentially, and it's affecting people within those countries differentially.
I think that's so well put. I mean, it's held up a mirror to so many inequalities. And listen, Prachi, I really want to ask you now about, in particularly about a specific solution that some people put forward to the education crisis, and I'm sure they will post COVID, which is to expand the role of the private sector and private education and these low cost private schools for poor people in developing countries. You've done a lot of work on this. Can you tell us what you think about this as a kind of solution to the problems we have with schooling?
There's two issues. The issue of gap filling, we have to be cognizant of the fact that the reason in a number of countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, that we saw this rise of low-fee private schools over the last 20 or so years is because there has been a hollowing out of good quality state provision. And that is a result of underfinancing in terms of the domestic budgets, but also in terms of the aid priorities, and also in terms of some of what we see from donors, and broader kind of global discourse around paying lip service to education for all, but not really investing in those systems in the way that we should. There is a real need for some of those providers to come in, but it really is a failure in terms of broad, good quality provision across the board. And where those providers do come in, there are still real concerns around equity. Who really can afford to send their children to these schools? I think in terms of really looking at what we mean when we talk about low fee or low cost schools, there's really not been a lot of clarity around that. So I've been pretty specific to define when I say low fee schools, that for me, for my studies, that means that the school cannot charge more than what a daily wage earner earns in a day. They cannot charge more than that in a month, right? So it's kind of trying to understand it's not perfect, it's not a perfect measure, but it's trying to understand what we mean is that we see really difficult choices that households have to make. They then start having to choose. Firstly, do we choose to send our children to school at all? And it's not a choice. It's just like, those are the circumstances. What do we do? It's not a real choice, right? With lots of options. Do we choose? Do we send them? And if we send them, which children go to which kinds of schools, and then for how long? And that's where we start seeing potential gender patterns emerge. We might see birth order patterns emerge, like maybe older children going to certain kinds of schools and younger children going to others. We might see potential in terms of this idea of ability, like, oh, she or he is the smarter kid, so we're going to send them to that kind of school. You know what I mean? So, really, in instances where the expansion or further intake of certain groups was default provided by a low fee private sector, going into the pandemic, I am really concerned about what that means, because if those schools are not going to be able to be financed directly by household fees, they were already precarious. State governments have their own education systems to actually look that in the vast majority of cases do cater for the most number of children, still has the largest infrastructure in most countries. Of course, there are exceptions, but I don't see this as a particularly hopeful situation, and it worries me to no end.
I think you're right, Prachi. Can I ask you particularly about the kind of big chains of international chains of private schools that are kind of expanding into the market in poor countries, trying to provide schooling using technology, trying to kind of use much more unskilled teachers and rely on tablets and teaching by computer. Can you explain their kind of worldview, how they see the future of education in poor countries?
When big capital comes in to finance on short timelines in education, all of this is driven by a rush for impact. And so technology is driven by that impact. But we need to be very targeted, and we need to actually understand that those initiatives are going to have some impact, but they cannot replace full education, well functioning education systems with full coverage of good quality en masse. They cannot replace.
And Prachi, coming to the end of the interview, just on that note, thinking about quality universal education for all, which is where you just ended that statement. How do we get there? I mean, I know that's a really big question to end on, but just thinking about what are some of the top solutions that we should be aiming for, big picture, and are you hopeful that we'll get there?
Yeah, that's like the $1 billion question, right? How do we get there? If we had that answer, look, we need to understand that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goal framework, and all of what we've been doing, at least since 1990, but it goes back further, since the 50s. But at least, let's say the SDGs, we were focusing on getting the remaining 200 and almost 60 million children who were out of school pre-pandemic, right? We have to understand that all of this action was really trying to get those children into school and maintain the gains we've had and increase quality. Now we're talking about almost that entire generation of children. I mean, wow. The impact of this is exponential. It's many, many fold. And it's long term. And it doesn't just mean focusing on low income, low middle income countries. It means focusing on all the countries and particularly focusing on pockets within those countries. I'm going to give an image. We tend to think of countries, low income and middle income, but really, I want people to end with this idea of the black holes of exclusion. And the black holes of exclusion that we're talking about are almost like constellations, right? Constellations of different people that are all connected by virtue of their exclusion. So we need to think about our solutions in a much more globally connected way and a more cross-sectoral way. Maybe if health is going to get more budget because we think that it will, and if social protection is going to get more budget because we think that it will, then are there parts of the education system that can be cross-financed because it actually serves those goals, right? Then I think we do have a way forward. And in this, I think that our countries that are low income countries and that have had to be dealing with emergencies for predating the pandemic, I think they're actually going to be ahead of the game in terms of having that modeling.
Prachi, thank you. And on that note, I think that we'll take it to the end of the interview. And thank you so much for bringing these issues together, thinking about countries and the relationship between communities, the need to see financing holistically, and indeed, hopefully, there is some ray of light in the quest for quality universal education for all. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you, Prachi. That was fascinating. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me on, Nadia and Max, and all good wishes to everyone.
Well, that was a very sobering conversation. My goodness. We see all these impacts today of the pandemic, but if I'm being fully honest, I don't think it's until this conversation with Prachi that I'm really starting to think about the long-term impacts of coronavirus.
Yeah, it was really shocking, wasn't it? Hearing how it could be decades before we're back to where we were before, and how so many of these pupils today are going to lose so much in terms of future earnings. It's just really sobering.
But we're joined now by Linda Oduor-Noah to talk about how things are looking on the ground in Kenya. Hi, Linda.
Hi, Nadia. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, Linda, it's great to hear your voice. We're really keen to get the kind of the perspective from Kenya, and particularly the impact on education and on kids from poor backgrounds of coronavirus. I mean, I think the schools have been closed more or less since March, haven't they?
Yes, they have, partially anyway.
In your experience, you've been working on education in Kenya for many years. What does it look like from there?
Well, maybe I'll take it chronologically. So obviously school closures were announced, and I think that was shocking to everyone. Schools have never been shut down nationally at that level. The learning loss conversations only came later. Initially, it was more the child protection issues that started coming out. It started dawning on me just how big a role schools played within our general society. Schools were safe houses, schools were child protection centers, schools were places for nutrition, the community centers. I think any inequality that we'd seen before was amplified during this period. But I think we'll be seeing the impacts of this period for a long time.
And so, Linda, what about the response of these so-called low-fee private schools, particularly the commercial chains like the ones that are mushrooming around East Africa? How have they been responding to coronavirus?
Right. So low-fee private schools, we have quite a number of them, especially in urban areas in Kenya. And to a large extent, they are the ones that provide a lot of education. Like 60% within urban informal settlements is provided by low-fee private schools. I remember immediately after lockdown was announced, we started hearing from people on the ground, teachers that teach at Bridge International Academies, how their salaries had been slashed to 10% of what they were earning. Now, this isn't a surprise to us because we have been undertaking research on chains of low cost, low fee private schools for a long time. And we knew from their track record, for them, profit is the bottom line. And so if they're not making money, then they're not going to meet any of the other obligations you'd expect, a school to meet. There's no mercy shown to students or to parents as long as they can't pay the fees. And we also know that they started teaching via WhatsApp, that a lot of parents could not access this platform. And so children continue being excluded from the school, not only for financial reasons, but just because they cannot access the tools that are being used by that particular school. They started asking for support from the government. They asked for concessional loans to be provided. I don't think this is the way that we should go. The Ministry of Education has very scarce resources, and whatever resources they get should go towards strengthening the public education system, not towards a loan service that has not been very transparent. So private solutions in Kenya are a very short-term option, but the long-term solution would be to invest in the public education system to make sure there's enough classes, enough teachers, enough space, rather than trying to fund or to shift their obligation onto low-fee cost providers.
What would you say that this pandemic has taught us about the education system in Kenya? What's working, what's not working?
Schools have been underfunded for a very long time. We know that teachers are not properly equipped. We know that there's not enough public schools in places where they are needed. And so all these things need to be looked at urgently and strategically, especially given the fact that financing is declining in all quarters. So I think we need to be very strategic about what our priorities are and what our values, the values that are driving our priorities as well. And they'll need to contend with the trade-offs that people are actually living with. Do I have to pay extra activity fees or extra water fees at school, or do my children eat? Or do we have a place to stay? And these are the trade-offs that parents are thinking of. And I think sometimes they actually forget who the parents are and what sacrifices they're making to ensure their children go to school.
And Linda, would you expect that there will be a big increase in the numbers of children out of school in Kenya in the kind of medium to long term?
It's a huge question, I think, that where people are avoiding. So, I mean, prior to COVID, we already had a huge out of school population. I mean, 800,000 to 1 million children is not a small number of children, right? And so now with COVID and the economic impact it's going to have on citizens, I do expect a lot of children, who will drop out of the system, definitely in the medium term. In the long term, depending on what the policymakers and decision makers decide, we could start reversing the trend once again. But even just seeing the fact that ODA might be declining, I saw the recent announcements in the UK last week of, foreign aid to education being cut. And the fact that a lot of our governments in sub-Saharan Africa are still aid dependent. What does that mean for the millions of children that were leaning on those grants? So yeah, it does look a bit dire. at the moment. But if people start thinking strategically from now, then hopefully the tide could shift in the long term.
That was a very interesting way to wrap up this conversation. Linda, thank you so much for giving us this perspective from the ground in Kenya. It was a really good way to contextualize the earlier conversation we had with Prachi. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Linda. That was great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you out there listening to our podcast today. And of course, our holiday season is coming up, and we wouldn't leave you hanging without one more 2020 episode. So do look out for that. Check out our earlier episodes, share with friends, leave us a 5-star review, and do follow us on Twitter @equalshope. Bye for now.